The bell ringer today, the question was, what did you learn about the conservative order? And that related to yesterday's notes when we talked about that stage that was set. And that was, of course, one of the three major political groups. And then the activity for today, the AP7 Politics, the graphic organizer, that will help you chart out the three different forms of politics and what exactly they believed in: conservatism, nationalism, which we talked about yesterday, and then, of course, liberalism. So we'll start with liberalism in the notes. And it's important to know that you hear this word a lot today, but it doesn't necessarily have the same point of reference as in the United States today as it does around the rest of the world, especially in the 19th century. It means something completely different. When we talk about liberals in the rest of the world, and especially in the past, in the United States, another comparable world is libertarian. So liberal today here in the U.S. doesn't mean the same as it did back then. But anyway, liberals were usually part of the educated elite. They believed in a lot of the Enlightenment ideals, so that's why they're known as the opposite of conservatives. They believed in toleration and freedom of the press and so on. So in that respect, they are actually the opposite of conservatives. They also are believers in having written constitutions. And so that is something else that makes them the opposite of conservatives. They also wanted free trade because they believed that barriers hindered efficiency. So less government regulation. In fact, they saw human activity often was a hindrance toward economic growth. Thomas Malthus, for instance, and Malthus is spelled Malthus. Malthus. Malthus thought that because people, especially through churches, were encouraged to have more children, that would increase the population and deplete the food supply, driving up prices. So he thought that was unnatural. I mean, people were going to have children, but since obviously in society many institutions encourage people to have kids, he thought that that created an unnaturally high food prices. David Ricardo, also an economist, believed that wages, when they went up, that falsely encouraged people to do the same, have more children, which ended up decreasing the overall standard of living. But he also thought that the market could handle those kinds of situations. For instance, whenever prices go up, then you have more people enter the workforce. And with more people entering the workforce, then companies don't have to pay as much, and so they can lower wages, for instance. And so everything would balance out in the end. So David Ricardo was kind of an extension of Adam Smith. Nationalists and liberals didn't necessarily get along all the time, but there would be sometimes compatibilities between the two. In fact, both of them usually backed a Republican form of government. So in other words, when we were electing representatives. They also both backed having broader civil rights and liberties. The key difference, though, is that nationalists wanted to support one specific group of people, whereas liberals didn't think that was necessary. So liberals often pushed for various government reforms to occur. And so while sometimes they could get support from nationalists, other times they saw them as more of an obstacle. One of the places where this occurred, of course, was in the Austrian Empire. There you can see all three groups of people working, usually toward different goals. The conservatives were led by Prince Metternich, which is spelled Metternich. Metternich. He, being a noble, of course, backed the idea of the status quo. And so he wanted to use Austria to try to dominate some of the other German states to thwart any attempt at developing a constitution. So the ruling family of Austria tried their best to protect the conservative order. However, as we pointed out earlier, the Austrian Empire included over a dozen different ethnic groups. And so many of these individual ethnicities supported nationalism. In fact, this is probably one of the places where it was a hotbed of nationalism. Places where you saw people relegated to second-class status. Within England, for instance, within actual England, there wasn't really a need for that because everybody was English. But once you get groups starting to butt heads, then you start to see more of a push toward nationalism. For instance, England dominating Ireland, or in this case, Austria dominating all the different ethnic groups that live within the empire. And of course, one of the other entities within the German-speaking territories that had their own political type of development would be Prussia. The Prussian leader, Frederick William III, had attempted some types of reforms by establishing diets or little legislatures. And so even though he's going to attempt to protect conservatism, he's still going to endorse some type of liberal reforms. But in his efforts, he is still going to manage to protect the status quo because most of the people that will end up sitting in these diets or legislatures are going to be lower aristocrats. Does anybody know what the lower aristocrats were called in Prussia?
Burgoys.
Junkers.
That's
Or Junkers. Junkers.
I took heroin.
However, there was a push, especially among German nationalists, for greater reform. And so there were student organizations that were often formed in order to push a nationalist agenda. Surprise, surprise, many times they were often anti-Semitic. Eventually, because of this, Metternich, having some sway over the German states, will advocate what are called the Carlsbad Decrees. The Carlsbad Decrees will outlaw these nationalist organizations from existing. But probably one of the places where you'll actually see some type of advancement would be in Britain, particularly amongst liberals. Although there, it will be compromising and extremely slow. Even though they already have a constitutional monarchy and a representative government, you still find aspects of conservatism in Britain, particularly through what are called the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws attempted to protect, of course, landowners who grew crops and created higher prices. That way they could gain greater revenue off of them. The Conservatives, led by Lord Liverpool in particular, attempted to protect a lot of those interests. But of course, with higher prices, that meant that people couldn't afford food to put on the table. And so eventually there'll be discontent from the lower class, the working class as it's called, throughout the rest of the world. And they will begin to protest in advocating getting rid of the corn laws. Sometimes large-scale meetings became unruly, disorganized. And so in response, Liverpool pushed for the passage of the Coercion Acts, which limited gatherings and also allowed the government to make quick arrests whenever these gatherings were happening. If they still happened spontaneously, the police could go in and just arrest people without explaining why or having evidence or charges. Limited gatherings. So people getting together could only happen in pre-approved circumstances.
COVID.
Well, this being for safety precautions because they are worried about the mass gatherings turning into riots. And in fact, in one instance, this did happen. Once the government started sending in militia, for instance, to stop gatherings from happening, then it did turn into riots. And eventually this resulted in militia firing on people in Manchester in what was commonly known as the Peterloo Massacre. There were more radical elements, though. For instance, in the Cato Street conspiracy, there was a plot by radicals to blow up the British cabinet. But that, of course, just gave more evidence that restrictions need to be placed on the people. And so that resulted in what was known as the Six Acts, which were various pieces of legislation that Parliament passed that restricted freedom of expression and movement. And the last place that I'll mention today here will be France. Despite the fact that all this change had started with France, you're going to see France go back exactly to no, maybe not exactly, but a lot of the way back to where it was at the early beginning of the French Revolution. The Bourbon family will be put back on the throne, and it will be led by Louis XVIII. Now, it would be a constitutional monarchy, so they'll have an elected legislature, but he will still remain on the throne. And then his successor will take the throne after he has passed away. It did keep intact most of the Declaration of Rights and religious toleration. However, there were many that participated in what was known as ultra-royalism. Usually French nobles and their supporters that would go around the countryside and harass people with liberal leanings and try to drive them out of the country. But underneath it all, of course, especially among the masses, there are still the hopes of having a more democratic form of government. So despite the fact that they have this king on the throne and they've appeased them with a constitutional monarchy, there is still the hopes for the people that eventually there'll be a more representative form of government. And as we know, France is extremely temperamental, especially Paris, so all it takes is a dire situation to come along to eventually cause the people to rise up and take action. And that's what will happen later on, but we'll talk about that on a different day. So for the remainder of the period, if you haven't finished up the midterm, please do so. And then the AP7 political differences chart can be completed as well.